Getting the exposure right is foundational for any videographer or filmmaker's journey. Video is pretty fragile when it comes to shadows and highlights, as there's a lot more information generally going into moving frames. High-end cameras can be more forgiving, but chances are that if you have a high-end camera, you had to start with a cheaper one and learn all of this from scratch at some point. Learning how to expose video often comes in different stages. With everything else that goes into getting great video, it's all about taking everything in smaller steps. Having the shutter speed set to double your frame rate and wanting the aperture to be low to get a shallow depth of field, for a lot of scenarios we are down to the ISO and ND filters as our primary ways of adjusting exposure, with aperture coming in second. The ISO we turn up if it's too dark, and the ND filters we use as sunglasses for our lenses when it's too bright. Starting with learning about filmmaking and shooting video, the first step is usually recording in a normal color profile. That means the footage is pretty much usable out of camera, but has less room to adjust the colors and overall look afterwards. That also means that exposing the video often is done by simply looking at the screen or viewfinder to see if the shot looks as it's supposed to. This works somewhat, as long as we are okay with relying on a small screen and maybe need a fast turnaround on the footage, or you're just still practicing how to shoot video. It's possible to get great results shooting like this, but it's not the most reliable way to get exposure correct. The main reason is that you rely on your eyes on a small screen, and the fact that if you switch to log at some point, it becomes an unusable technique due to log being a flat profile and you can't trust the exposure with your eyes on the screen itself. So when you progress to the next stage, which for most means shooting in log to capture more information and detail and protecting the highlights and the shadows, as we can't trust the image on the screen anymore to see if anything is clipping in the highlights or shadows, we have to progress to the next stage of exposing the video. For most consumer cameras, shooting in log means that the standard way of exposing is to shoot 1.3 to 2 stops overexposed. That's because most sensors shooting in log have an easier time protecting the highlights compared to the shadows. This works great as a fast solution to dial in your videos, but doesn't give a very detailed overview of what's happening in the footage. As we can't properly analyze what's going on with the footage with our own eyes, we rely on the light meter telling us if it's overexposed correctly, usually by around plus 1.7 stops depending on the camera and log profile that you're shooting with. Where the issue lies is that the sensor will be measuring the entire frame, and if it's very bright outside, it'll be much quicker to reach 1.7 stops overexposed, and the opposite if it's very dark, and you'll have to crank the ISO up very high for the camera to see it as plus 1.7. So while this method is quick and easy, it doesn't tell us if the important parts of the frame are exposed correctly or not. Skin tones, if there are any, are one of the most important things to correctly expose, and we can't get a good reading if we're just exposing with this technique. To get a more precise reading of what we're trying to expose, we're led to the next stage of exposing our videos. This third stage uses zebras to help us properly expose any frame. Zebras are stripes that you can activate on most newer cameras, allowing you to show 1 or 2 areas of exposure in the frame. Simply put, it takes the frame and reads it from 0 to 100 in brightness, or IRE as it's called in proper terms, and shows you what parts of the frame lie within the specific selections of brightness that you've asked it to show. For shooting in log and exposing skin tones, most log profiles should have the skin tones be exposed around 52 to 56 IRE. So when you're using zebras, we can set the zebra 1 to 55 plus minus 5 to get a reading of anything between 50 and 60 IRE. If the skin tones in the frame has zebra 1 stripes on them, we know they're exposed correctly. If we're exposing for an object, a good rule of thumb is exposing for middle gray, which is around 35 IRE. So having zebra 1 set to 35 plus minus 5 will help expose for these scenarios. Zebra 2 can help us protect the highlights, as this value works for a certain value and above. To help you protect the highlights from blowing out, setting zebra 2 to 90 or 95 will indicate if anything is lying in this area, and above meaning it's close to getting overexposed or overexposed already. Zebras are the stage on which most of us stop and are satisfied. It provides us with an easy way of measuring the exposure of certain values and making sure it's correct. There's a last stage though, which is slightly more advanced but allows us to fully read the entire scene. This fourth stage is using false color. For most cameras, that'll mean that you'll have to have an external monitor to get these readings. Using false colors enables you to read all the IRE values of the entire frame at once by overlaying a different inverted or false color on top of the frame. Similar to zebras, where 35 is middle gray, 55 is skin tones, and plus 90 is things that are overexposed, the same goes for false colors, now having a color for each area, making it possible to see them all at once. The same goes for the rest of the brightness scale, allowing you to see exactly how your frame is exposed in lock and if anything is clipping while you expose the skin or the object correctly. With false color, you have everything you need to get perfect exposure if you know how to work your camera and change the settings according to your needs. The downside is that the entire frame is covered in false colors, so it's something that you'll switch on and off while you're shooting so that you can focus on the framing and the focus, whereas zebras makes it a bit easier to see both the exposure and the frame itself while you're shooting. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial walking you through all the different stages of exposing video. The purpose was to help you understand the different steps you take on your journey and where the strengths and weaknesses lie in each step.